to zoom into, because Marc Faber is going to give my conclusion, I have respect for his opinion. The idea is I like currencies without a government, because at no time in history did we have more reliance on expert error. At no time in history did we have more unforecastable random variables we're relying on. Because I showed in a black swan, and you can show it technically, and now I'm showing it a lot more technically, why we have degradation of forecastability. If you take random variable, there are some metrics like kurtosis, we cannot, our forecast errors are increasing a lot. So you need less dependence on experts, more organic robustness. We need currencies without a government. So effectively we're converging to currencies without government, because anybody I know who has 3/4 of a brain has, as we heard, a little bit of gold. Or I don't like gold because central banks have gold. Anything central banks have, I want to move away from. So I have other substitute to gold, all right? Plus I don't have any dentist in my family, so I don't have that culture of gold, but you know, I have the other similar items to gold. So we're moving into an environment in which people who have a brain will understand that you don't want to rely on governments. They incur deficits, they pillage you, and you stock up on something like assets, and that becomes your numerator. So you can talk dollars all you want. Because when people tell me, what do you like better, the dollar or the euro? I say, what? It's like, what do you want prefer, Charybdis or Scylla? You know, I don't want that choice. I can construct my own world. So this is what I have to say to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Taleb. And here we have already sort of intrigued some conflicting statements, such as no alternative to dollar, as Roubini mentioned at the beginning. Then Professor Phelps mentioned that gold and euro are sort of substitutes, sort of alternatives. And maybe next speaker, Michael Power, who also has some experience dealing with sovereign wealth funds, who use those alternative or quasi-alternatives to the dollar, may say something.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to say this morning isn't really going to contradict what is said before, but rather to try and map out the world of currencies as I see them developing over the next decade. I think up until now, and probably by default now, we've lived in a very binary world. Let me use a metaphor. In the Northern Hemisphere, when you're navigating, you have the ease of one star, Polaris, which represents north. And it's very easy for the navigator to move forward. And I feel as though that's by and large the way that we've lived the world of currencies. We think of everything versus the dollar, the euro versus the dollar, the yen versus the dollar, the pound versus the dollar. It's a very binary valuation process. I live in the southern hemisphere, and we can't see the North Star, so we can't use that for navigation. We don't have an equivalent star in the southern hemisphere that we can use. We actually have to use 6 stars, a combination of the Southern Cross and Alpha and Beta and Centauri, in order to be able to triangulate where south is. And when you've done this complex piece of geometry in the sky, you have some idea of where you're going. And I think that's pretty much the world that we're now sailing into. I think we're going to move out of a world where we had this binary relationship in terms of valuation with the dollar, and into a world where we're going to have a much more complex piece of variable geometry that we have to undertake as investors in order to be able to determine fair value for a given currency. And in that world, I always say that it's going to be obviously not so much the Southern Cross, but the brick cross that is going to increasingly start featuring as a new constellation in the sky. Another way of thinking about it is the rise of the 4 R's, because rather conveniently, all 4 currencies of the BRICS begin with the letter R. You have your Brazilian real, your Russian ruble, your Indian rupee, and your Chinese renminbi. Some people are even talking about a 5th BRIC in the form of Indonesia. Conveniently, you have the Indonesian rupiah as well. So you can stay in the land of R, but they're going to increasingly feature in the valuation methodology that we as investors are going to have to use in order to determine fair value. And it's going to take a big jump. The CNBC community are going to have to start reporting on a relatively regular basis secondary cross rates in currencies which people are not familiar with. And this is something that I predict over the next decade, is that we're going to be looking at secondary crosses where the dollar is not one of the two crosses that we're looking at, and they're going to become increasingly important for those of us investors in terms of determining fair value. So it's going to be a much more complex world that we're going to move into, and if you're trading currencies, you're going to have to think in more than 2 or 3 dimensions. It's going to become very, very difficult. Let me give you a micro example of how this is already happening. In the Gulf, in the gold souks of the Gulf and the Middle East generally, you've probably got some of the best gold traders in the world. And over the last couple of years, they've noticed that looking at the dollar price of gold has actually not been a particularly good indicator of what's going to be going on, other than to some extent it moves usually in reverse. But what's really given them medium-term indication of what's happening is by looking at the Indian rupee price of gold and increasingly the Chinese renminbi price of gold, not surprisingly, because in terms of gold consumption now, 20% of the world's gold is consumed in India and 20% is consumed in China. And so you're starting to get clever traders realize that there's actually value to be got from looking at the world of currency through a different set of glasses. And I think that's the world that we're moving into. And I agree with basically what's been said. And I think that the catalyst for this process is probably going to be the realization that there really is serious trouble in Polaris, in the main star that we've generally speaking used to value things up until now, namely particularly the US dollar. And I think that people are going to have to start moving out of it. We've got one client at the moment who values himself in Singapore dollars. He's not in any way an Asian, but his base currency is Singapore dollars because he's just come to realize that that's probably a better place to base himself, at least in terms of his investments, than anywhere else at the moment. I don't say it's going to be the future place where he should be based, but I understand his reasoning from moving out of the dollar. And I think that a number of investors are starting to regard, for instance, what was previously called cash management as currency management. Because if you haven't got the currency overlay now, you're really not thinking hard enough about your investments. In our emerging market debt fund last year, 70% of our alpha came from managing currencies and only 30% from actually managing the bonds. So you can see that currency itself is truly growing up, probably should have always been all along, but it's becoming the fifth asset class. And I think this is something which investors, again, are starting to grasp. And it's really starting to make a difference in our world. If we go into a presentation and don't talk about currency when we're trying to talk about a particular set of investments at the moment, we're missing out on half of the opportunity of gaining alpha that we probably could be. One particular thing that I wanted to talk about, which sort of relates to Russia, and I live in South Africa and we suffer from the same problem, and one of the issues which I think commodity countries are going to face generally over the next decade is going to be the possibility of being inflicted by that dread disease, the Dutch disease, which is what happens when the terms of trade affecting your exports, in this case commodities, tend to improve relative to your imports. And we're going to see that happen. We are seeing it happen. Russia, at least over the last year, has sat a little bit on its currency. Not so Brazil, not so South Africa. And the result is that we're beginning to see some quite serious internal issues developing in terms of the industrial economies of those countries. One other aspect of this is I suspect that currencies are going to become very much more political over the next decade. The free-floating idea, I think, is going to become heavily constrained. When resource-rich countries, and I go to quite a few, ask me, what should we be doing about the management of our currency, nearly always I say is, well, if I don't usually like giving heavy pieces of advice, but be very careful about letting your currency appreciate too much against the Western basket that, generally speaking, people refer against today. And I think that's the advice that I would give for Russia. It's the advice that I give always when I go to the sovereign wealth funds of the Middle East, and they're going through a lot of heart searching at the moment as to what they should be doing with their currencies. And I say, by and large, what you're doing at the moment is the right thing. You're fixed to the dollar, so you're not allowing your currency to appreciate too much. Anyway, those are my opening remarks, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you. And now we are moving to Marc Faber. So it's Gloom or Boom? Where are we now?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Nassim, I think you insulted pilots. You shouldn't compare central banks to pilots, even if they're incapable. They still were able to lift the plane. But over the long term, I have one forecast about which I have a very high degree of confidence. And this is that the ultimate value of the US dollar will be precisely zero. And so over time you have to move out of dollars, and let me explain you why I think that the US dollar will go to zero. As you know, in America we have at the Federal Reserve a man who basically is not a central banker, but he's the apprentice of Gutenberg, a money printer. And under his influence, interest rates were already kept artificially low after 2001. The Fed fund rate was cut from January 2001 to June 2003 from 6.5% to 1%, and then kept at 1% until June 2004, when in fact the US economy began to recover in November 2001. So almost 3 years into an economic recovery, you had a Fed fund rate at 1%. And then after September 2007, he slashed again the Fed fund rate to essentially zero at the present time. So we have very, very low interest rates right now. Over the same period of time, the total credit market debt in the US increased at 5 times the rate of nominal GDP. In other words, between 2000 and 2007, GDP increased by $4.2 trillion and total credit market debt by $21.3 trillion. And as Nassim pointed out, the private sector is actually acting rationally at the present time and is reducing the leverage, and credit growth on the private sector is diminishing, but is offset by government increase in credit. And so you get enormous amount of economic volatility, but as a percent of the economy, total credit is still expanding. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the cause of the crisis was excessive credit growth that led to economic and monetary instability and then caused the crisis. But the causes have not been addressed, but actually aggravated through the intervention by the government and the increase now in government debt. Now the government debt, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that the government has basically taken over at the present time, is 140%. Total credit market debt in the US is 375% of GDP compared to 140% of GDP in 1980. But that does not include the unfunded liabilities that will arise from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. If you included those, then the government debt, including Fannie Mae and the unfunded liabilities, is already over 600% of GDP. And then you add the private debt to it. In my opinion, the debt mountain in the US is already so colossal that you will only be able to print and print and print. One of the problems being for the government debt that, of course, at the present time, with the fiscal deficits of over $1 trillion, the government debt will keep on growing very rapidly. And actually, the worse the economy, the more the debt will expand. Now, at some point in future, the problem will arise because interest rates will go up. If you have interest rates at zero, like Mr. Bernanke is keeping at the present time, then the funding of the government debt is not a problem, because you can just issue T-bills and other central bankers buy them. Nobody else would, but the central bankers do. So, but one day, when the interest rates will go up, the interest burden on the total government debt